this case, it connects to Black Lives Matter. So there will be two theoretical perspectives I'll be using as a framework for my study. The first one is social identity theory. And this explains the process in which we as individuals give ourselves a sense of who we are based on how we associate with others. And essentially, we formulate our identity by taking social categories and comparing them to others and solidifying them into an identity. And under assumption of social identity, there's an assumption that we always look for social spaces and stimuli to help reinforce our identity. And along that journey, we come along things that are called social identity threats. And this is an entity targeted at a person or social group with the intent of devaluing one's competence, undermining the group's uniqueness, or attack norms and practices within the group. And when we feel the presence of a social identity threat, we as individuals go through something that's called social identity threat management. This explains the process, the cognitive response individuals utilize to cope with incoming identity threats. Second theoretical framework I'll be using is called critical race theory. And this is the theoretical perspective of approaching research to better understand the relationship between race, racism, and power. And there's a lot of things that encompass around critical race theory, but for this study, I'll be focusing on three. So the first tenet explains the idea that racism is not real, and it's not an aberration. Ultimately, it's ingrained in the U.S. society and a part of our landscape. U.S. society has historically oppressed disadvantaged groups due to race, class, nationality, and other social intersections. The second tenet explains that social justice and eliminating systemic racism is at the core of critical race theory. Within sports, this tenet focuses on the effects athletes make to challenge leaders and stakeholders in making this a part of their agenda. Historically, most owners shy away from this because of the social and financial consequences that come from speaking out. And lastly, it explains the idea that racism is not always easy to find. It's not always up in your face, and it comes in a lot of different forms. And the ones I'll be focusing on is called colorblind racism. This explains how whites viewing race as an irrelevant factor in American society in order to avoid the appearance of being outwardly racist. And they actually believe that by not seeing color, they are absolved from being racist. Cornelia Silva explains this in 4 different dimensions. The first dimension is called abstract liberalism. And this is honestly the most important and the hardest one to find. And it explains that it incorporates the ideas of equal opportunity, meritocracy, economic choice, and liberalism to explain racial matters. This is a way to often diminish the presence of minorities without coming off as outwardly racist and downplaying practical strategies such as boycotts and protests to address social injustices and deem as too radical. The second dimension is called naturalization, and this allows whites to explain racial disparities as natural occurrences following natural sequence. The third one is called cultural racism, and this is how whites rely on culturally based arguments to explain racial matters. And lastly, we have minimization of racism. And this suggests that discrimination is something that's no longer affecting minority lives. So there was a lot of references that I used as a framework, but I'll be focusing on 2 just for the sake of time. So a study done in 2018, there was a qualitative study to find the dominant themes of conversation surrounding this protest, as you can see, that was demonstrated at the ESPYs in 2016. The contributing authors in this study, it's cited in my references, February 2018. They qualitatively coded 10,000 Facebook comments to find themes surrounding race, facts, and crime rates, police accountability, and many other themes. And the second study that I'll be really focusing on as a framework, it's referenced in my thesis as Sanderson 2016. So on November 29, 2014, 5 Black players demonstrated a hands up, don't shoot gesture in response to the murder of Michael Brown. As you can see pictured here, These are 5 players on the St. Louis ranks at the time who are now the LA ranks. So Sanderson's study found that there are several themes of social identity threat management within Facebook and Twitter comments. So what is my study? My study will reveal the identities and viewpoints sports fans take on when Black athletes exercise their freedom of speech. And there will be 3 questions that help guide me to find those themes. So research question number 1 has a part 1 and a part 2. So the first part is, what were the overall responses of NBA fans and observers to the Milwaukee Bucks protests in response to the shooting of Jacob Blake? And part 2, what were the most prominent and represented themes and messages conveyed by the Facebook comments and tweets in response to the Milwaukee Bucks protests? And question number 2, in what ways did fans attempt to reduce threats to their social identity by engaging in commentary using colorblind racism? So for my study, comments were collected under the following 2 posts. As you can see, I kept them consistent from the same source, one from Facebook and one from Twitter, and they were documented on the same day. Comments under these posts were copied and pasted verbatim onto an Excel sheet for further analysis. So the methodology of the type of analysis that I engaged in is called content analysis. And this is a form of research to find a way to measure text. And more specifically, a type of content analysis is called thematic analysis. This is the way we report patterns of narratives within data. So first, you have to engage in initial reading and engage in something that's called data immersion. From there, you eliminate comments that do not fit the criteria of the established framework. So again, social identity theory is what we're looking at, as well as critical race theory. The Milwaukee Bucks protests served as that social identity threat. So comments that were ads, replies to other users were not a part of the data. From there, you keep collecting and coding data until you reach data saturation. And that basically means that the data that you are collecting and that you're finding are no longer significant. They're just redundant of the themes that you've already established. From there, I rank and clearly define these themes into a code book. And my data analysis and my coding process goes through what is called peer debriefing. And this is where I look towards other researchers to give me objective feedback and to make sure I'm not missing points or emphasizing other ones, and also making sure I'm applying the frameworks correctly when I'm coding these comments. So the data analysis goes through 2 types of coding. One is called deductive coding, and themes are defined and coded based on previous ideas and research on the respective themes. And as we mentioned earlier, so the Sanderson piece acted as that theoretical framework that was already established for social identity threat management themes. And the Bonilla-Silva's 4 dimensions of colorblind racism act as those established themes that I was coding for. We also, after that, I went through something called inductive coding, which is cultivating themes as they emerge from the data. So if there was narratives and themes that I found within comments that did not fit under the established themes, then I looked towards to find other ways of understanding what I was reading. So this is just to give you an example of a comment. As you repeatedly read it, you start to highlight words and start to apply these words back into the frameworks, and to make sure that when you're looking to code them, they match the framework. So again, these are a list of the previously established themes. So again, the Sanderson piece, he found 11 social identity threat management themes, and Bonilla-Silva's, of course, 4 dimensions of colorblind racism. So now I'll be getting into my findings, and the themes that are highlighted in red will act as the emergent social identity threat management themes. And these are the themes that, again, do not match the Sanderson piece and emerge from my own data. So, overall reactions, 86% of the comments were negative. They voiced their disapproval for the Milwaukee Bucks protests in some form or fashion, and referenced the thesis for further explanation of how it happened. So for the sake of time, I'll be focusing on the top 6 social identity threat management themes, but overall there was 10 themes. So the most prevalent theme was general criticism commentary. And this was defined as brief targeted criticism of the actions of the players or the league. This sort of criticism also includes alluding to the lack of views the NBA is receiving since their outward support for Black Lives Matter. Second most prominent theme was punishment commentary. This was defined as a fan delegating their own form of punishment for the team and organization based on how they view the protest. And also tied for second is an emergent theme that came from the data, and this is called dehumanization commentary. And this was deemed as a comment that voices a cognitive bias towards the Bucks players, professional athletes, or Jacob Blake based on their own perception. These comments involve expressing disgust towards the targeted party instead of looking for ways to empathize. So the fourth most prominent theme was general support commentary. And this was deemed as briefly expressing support for either the execution or the intent behind the protest. This also includes announcing new fandom for the Bucks or the NBA due to the protest. Fifth most prominent theme was racist commentary, and is explicitly expressing racist or discriminatory overtones to speak on their opinion. Yeah. And the sixth one again is an emergent theme. It's whataboutism commentary. And this is when a fan attempts to defend against criticism of their values by turning away from the original issue or argument at hand. So here's a graphic here of all of my themes, and as you can see, the most prominent ones are up towards the top, and so you see general criticism commentary, followed by the latest conduct. So now we get into the extent of colorblind racism. So for the Facebook pool of data comments, 51% of the time, when you saw a fan voicing disapproval for the Milwaukee Bucks protest, it has some form of colorblind racism. So again, we're coding for social identity threat management as well as colorblind racism. And there was a lot of themes that fit under one comment. So 51% of the time, both were present. On Twitter, different story. Only about 20%. So now let's I'm going to show a couple examples of how these 4 dimensions of colorblind racism were shown throughout the study. So again, just to remind you, abstract liberalism involves using ideas associated with political liberalism, economic liberalism, in abstract manner to explain racial matters. Cultural racism is a frame that relies on culturally based arguments, such as Mexicans do not put much emphasis on education to explain minority circumstances. Minimization of racism is a frame that suggests that discrimination is no longer a central factor affecting minority life chances or opportunities. And naturalization is a frame that allows whites to explain a racial phenomenon by suggesting they are natural occurrences. So these are notable subthemes. And now, again, when you're looking to code with social identity threat management, as well as colorblind racism, these were some of the themes or narratives that hit underneath general social identity threat management. So the most prominent one that I'll start with is general criticism commentary along with abstract liberalism. This allowed fans to voice their opinion and displeasure for the protest due to the perception of it having little effect on society moving forward. This is, again, a way to diminish a practical strategy to raise awareness on this social issue and in focus. General criticism commentary along with naturalization allowed fans to shape false narratives on the NBA as a whole and what they stood for. Punishment commentary along with abstract liberalism painted the narrative to use notional ideas of economic individualism, privilege, choice to explain this matter. They suggest.
Oh my God. It froze? Perhaps.
They must have lost connection.
Mm-hmm. Oh no.
Or is it me?
I don't know. It might be us.
Oh no.
Crap.
What do I do? Wait, I'm trying on my phone.
Try your phone. I'm gonna stop this because.
No, hold on.
Oh wait. No. It says in the chat. It says we are having problems connecting to the network.
Okay.
Oh my god.
Okay, wait. Hold on. That's
He's doing so well. Is it us or them?
I don't know the meeting URL right now. Do you know it?
Oh God, I don't know. Not right now. Where's the picture? Oh, come on.
What happened?
There's the screen. What is happening?
Oh my gosh. Oh. We all lost it. We froze.
I don't know if we all lost it. It could just be us.
Faded towards,
Oh,
towards negative, towards black athlete activism, towards the monkeypox protests.
okay.
And that would suggest that, black athletes really do hesitate at times when they engage in this activism. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, the Twitter comments had far less instances of colorblind racism being present. And part of that is that Twitter has a 140 character limit. And when I was looking to code and understand what I was looking at, there just wasn't enough content to match it up to the definitions as the framework. Facebook, however, had a different story, and it had its no character limit. So I was able to code and easily see what the narratives were. And that leads to my bigger point. Social identity threat management acting as a mechanism for colorblind racism. And this is the huge thing that I'm looking to contribute towards the field. Sanderson did the study to help find what social identity threat management themes are present. But what he didn't investigate are some of the underlying racial prejudice that are present when you're engaging in this process. A lot of times in these Facebook comments, you were able to see that at first they were alluding to their disapproval of the Bucks protest, but later on you are able to see that they're exposing the racial prejudice as they continue to give more and more content. And I thought to make my point a little bit more clear and to bring it home, I brought up in this comment. They sit and do nothing, maybe throwing some cash out and getting involved in the off season, getting involved in the city state that overpays for them for playing a game 6 months out of the year. When the camera's on them, then it's time to sit, I guess. I bet if they didn't get paid, they would change their tune. I know men and women who served and sacrificed for far less money. In the United States Marine Corps, I didn't see colors. We were all green. We stood and fought together. We are a family, and always faithful. So again, as you can see, as you started out, you can see that it related to Milwaukee Bucks protest, and he was managing against that threat. But then underneath, as he kept saying more and more, it had far less relevance. And this was something that you were not able to see in the Twitter comments, so ethically I couldn't code it the same way. So the implications, and this is where we talk about how organizations can look at my study and understand the data. Black athlete activism, as I said earlier, will always continue to evolve. And organizations, corporate companies, sponsors have big choices to make moving forward. The Bucks organization, for example, stood behind their players, even though they had no idea of their intentions to protest. So organizations will be able to give a glimpse of why fans do not like demonstrations of black athlete activism. And the bigger point stands towards stakeholders, talking about athletes and fans. You can think about the NFL in 2016, when Colin Kaepernick started to protest. The NFL tried various ways, all types of ways to suppress him and others from protesting. And a lot of that came from that pressure from the former president, bringing upon pressure, calling them SOBs, and telling them to stand up for the national anthem. And the NFL ultimately chose that side and decided not to stand up for their players. But fast forward to 2020 and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, they came around for so and apologizing for their previous stances without really even pointing out Colin Kaepernick's name in the first place. But to make my point a little bit even stronger, I want to bring into the frame a league that really gets it right. When they never shy away from social injustice and always back up their players.
The women. Yeah.
And this would be the WNBA. And society as a whole, I feel like, just doesn't do it right. They don't give them their justice, and they've been doing it for the longest, and they're approaching So as you can see on the team on the right is the Atlanta Dream. And heading into their summer of 2020 season, they made an outward support for Black Lives Matter, and also dedicating their entire play season to Breonna Taylor. So, for the most part, all the teams and players were all for it, except for one person. The woman on the left is the former Atlanta Dream owner by the name of Kelly Loeffler. And she voiced her opinions against the Black Lives Matter movement, and the players really didn't take on to that. And they started to engage in protests to force her to sell the team and to ultimately lose her U.S. Senate seat because there was an election year and she was running against Raphael Warnock at the same time. So ultimately the WNBA had a choice to make. Do you stand behind the stakeholders of an owner of the team, or do you stand behind their players and you back them up and let their platform be shown? Ultimately, they chose the players. Fast forward to January 2021, Kelly Loeffler lost her U.S. Senate seat in the runoff vote, and was forced to sell the team months later, and sold the team to one of her former players. The player on the right her name is Renee Montgomery, who used to play for the Atlanta Dream in 2018 and 2019. And prior to 2020, she opted out of the WNBA season as they were heading into the bubble. And this just goes to show you the changes that can really happen when you give the support behind their players. It's not just from a money and revenue standpoint, but from a legal changes standpoint, it can really be powerful. So ultimately, my study is not perfect, and there's limitations that I gotta point out. So despite the fact that I collected a lot of qualitative data, there's a lot of comments, it's unclear to whether this concept really wholeheartedly represents people's stances across all Black athlete activism, like the Northwest protest. And social media, as we know, is home to several trolls. There's bots out there, there's people that just look to engage in conversation and debate just cause a problem. So there was no way for me to really know that. And the sample size and the time is really just a product of just being able to put this together in one semester. But in the future, for people that do have that time, I would really suggest, conducting interviews to allow for evolution to play a role. So as you can see, maybe when you allow evolution to play a role, that means when you see Black athlete activism happen over and over a longitudinal approach, maybe you can investigate and see if fans' opinions change at that point. Another thing is demographic change. When I was collecting the data, I did not go through their social media profiles to see any of the demographic trends like race, gender, et cetera, et cetera. And along with the Milwaukee Bucks protests and their societal issues they put in focus, other ones are women's in sports. And there can be similar studies done to look into how fans react to protests around these disparities as well. So in the end, people have to realize that people utilize forms of colorblind racism to solidify or protest or protect their social identity in reaction to Black athlete activism. The idea of sports and politics don't mix is just simply not true. There's no longer a time where sports is some neutral space. There are too many intersections that just give us a different story. And sports is such a huge platform and opportunity, so why don't we just embrace that? Mm-hmm. And in this moment, as we take time to exhale, it is imperative to state that Black Lives Matter in sport. And lastly, I just wanted to give out some flowers and some thanks. First, starting with my family. You guys saw me for countless of hours, putting in a lot of work, just coming from a full-time job straight to the bedroom or straight to an office to put this thing together. And you guys were there to support and allow me to make those sacrifices to put this together. So family and friends, thank you guys so much. Your support does not go unnoticed. To Dr. Burton, Dr. Mullen, Dr. McGarry, I think you all are serving as inspirations and serving as that teacher for me. You guys really gave me inspiration into diving into topics like Black athlete activism and gave me a lot of freedom to really dive deep into what I'm passionate about. Charles, Max, You guys played a huge part in the status analysis and also serving as secondary advisors, and I can't thank you guys enough. You guys are busy as it is as PhD students, so being able to give yourself time to invest in me means a lot. Corinne, I don't know if you're here, but I really thank you for improving my writing quality. For you guys that don't know, she's part of UConn's Writing Center, and I met with her every Monday night, really going over the thesis and critiquing my writing style, and she gave me a lot of confidence. Going through this journey with her, that really helped, and can't thank you enough for that. And lastly, I want to give a huge thank you to my classmates and other faculty members. You guys, I really just appreciate the experience that we have in the classroom. It's unfortunate a global pandemic cut the last year, but I'm really excited to see what you guys do in the future. I wish you guys the best of luck. So with all that being said, that is the end of my presentation. And I'll open up for questions.
All right.
If folks want to use their emojis or let their screen be shown so that you can clap and congratulate.
Well, we have to get down here if we're gonna put our screen on.
Oh, wait, bring it up then. Just bring it up. There's a chair.
I suspect it'll be good to.
I unplugged it from there, because if you want me to bring it over,
Here.
I gotta.
Here. Put it here.
And claps.
Alright.
And go back to your slides so that if there are questions from the committee or from members of the audience that you need to reference the slides, that'll be helpful.
Okay.
Like I noted, we'll start with Dr. McGarry and Dr. Mala's questions first, and then if we have time, we'll open it up to the rest of the audience.
Okay, cool.
While you're doing that, I'm gonna try to split screen it for a second so I can see the slides as well as and see you guys as well. Unless you want me to share the screen while I'm answering the questions.
Whatever you're going to feel most comfortable with, Merlin. I know this is not the easiest way to do these kinds of presentations, so I want you to feel comfortable.
Okay. I mean, I'd rather face you guys when answering questions, but I'll share the screen to make my points.
So let's keep it like that, and then if we need to go to the screen, we can go to the screen. How about that?
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So either Dr. McGarry or Dr. Malo, would you like to start the questions?
I'll go. It's harder to kind of navigate who's going first. I'm looking at you, Jesse, but I don't know if you know that I'm looking. First of all, Merlin, thank you. I'm struck throughout this process at how you have approached the topic, how you have engaged it as a scholar, as well as with someone who obviously has strong feelings personally about the research and the activism, and to watch you navigate that has really been insightful and educational for me, so thank you for that. And I also wanted to say I was very struck with your acknowledgments. First, that you engaged the Writing Center in the ways that you did, and then that the Writing Center employees here in your defense. I honestly don't think I've ever seen either of those things done in the way that you've done them. And I also wanted to appreciate that you thanked your classmates. That's also something that we rarely, if ever, see in a thesis defense. So that, I think, points to you as a person and as a scholar, and just wanted to point those things out. I put a question in the document as I read it, and I saw that you, in some ways, attempted to address it in the presentation today. And so I wanted to ask you just to dig in a bit more, and I realized that you didn't examine the demographic trends of Facebook and Twitter users.
Yeah.
But I am very curious about those trends and how those may or may not have had an impact on the comments that folks made. You clearly address the character limitations in Twitter and how that contributed to what folks were able to say or what they were limited in saying. But I would like to ask you, as you think about this possibility of future research, how might you go about examining the demographic trends in the users in general, and then the users or the folks that posted the actual segments that you would use or did use in this study?
Sure. So the reason why I didn't really look into Facebook profiles and understanding that is that with any sort of academic work, there's biases that we have ourselves. And I didn't want to just look at a person that was white and to assume that the commentary was going to be racist or something like that. To avoid that, when you're in a thematical analysis of just content, it's just about the content, right? So it can't just be about prejudice that you have towards the person who did it. So I feel like that was the huge important part of why, when I was filtering the comments and copying and pasting, all I did was just take down the name just to make sure it wasn't duplicate. And I didn't take down any other information, just to focus on the content. To address it, maybe in future research, maybe just, if there was like a black screen to kind of just, somebody sits down and it's done anonymously, maybe something like that. But again, it's really hard to avoid that initial prejudice that we all have.
I'm going to ask a quick follow-up on that. So I definitely agree in terms of looking at, in a content analysis, looking at the content. And then I guess the follow-up question would be, are there, or how would you go about identifying just user trends, not even necessarily connecting a user with a comment, but just general trends on who's posting, who's using those different platforms, and are there differences that might play themselves out in a study?
So potentially maybe looking into the trends of users like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they're always doing data collection in terms of the age and the location. Maybe looking into those sort of demographics to see if somebody is located in this certain state and you're looking at walking bus, they're going to react to it this way. And a lower, maybe a younger age may be more appreciative of Black athlete activists. You look at their age, and a lot of times you got to put in before you make a social media account. So those are just a few ideas off the top of my head.
Thanks for that, and I'll pass it off to Dr. Mala with one comment. I think that as you made the connection in this study between people's identification with their identity, like their connection to their own identity, and part of that being their fandomship. I think that kind of data around fan base and social media users could be useful in future studies. So that's why I'm putting this question out to you. And I'll pause and pass it off to Dr. Mala, and if we come back around again, I'll be ready.
Great job, Merlin. Congratulations, man.
Really
Appreciated all that you've done. Appreciated seeing you grow as a student and as a fellow scholar, quote unquote, at this point. Look at you all spiffy in your suit now. Appreciate it, even just working together with you during this thesis project and seeing you grow as a writer and as a scholar. So great work, Merlin. I think in my early comments this week that I had sent out to you, I don't know if you had a chance to look at that before your presentation here, but I just want to address one of my comments. I think overall, we all agree here within this room why your research is important, but I'm wondering if you can dive in more in terms of the implications of your research to the sport management field. Like, why would it be important for me as a athletic director, as an owner of a sport organization, to be aware of colorblind racism among our spectators and or fans, right? So I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit more, Merlin.
Sure, and the first thing I'll do that I'm thinking of it is I'm gonna go back to share my screen. I'm gonna share one of the slides. It's one of the where I first first presented in the findings. So a lot of times in these corporations and organizations, they come out with just a poll or a review, and you can see like they just give a quick question. Maybe the example is like, did you like this? And then the answers are just yes or no. And if you just did that 418 times and there was 480 respondents, the graph would look exactly like this. And then I'll stop sharing my screen to kind of say that what makes my study a little bit more nuanced is that I'm giving reasons as to why those answers are no, right? Instead of just saying yes or no, I give more reasons. Okay, what's behind them not liking? And when you're able to see the comments, and it's like a review section, and you're leaving comments, that's essentially what they're doing. And allowing organizations to do some internalizing themselves. So like an example, the NFL, all they want can be like Black Lives Matter, and such as much they want. But if they don't address the racial prejudice that goes on when hiring coaches, where are they getting? Right, so eventually you gotta make a choice about where you stand on these fans, and know that, you know, at the end of the day, there's always gonna be racist fans, and no matter what you do, they're gonna look to stand on that. But what's more important is standing behind these players. And given that review in my study will give you that choice that you can do some internalizing yourself as an organization.
Just to follow up on that, Merlin, just to go a little further, so now we know, right, according to your study and your findings, with the sample size that we have, that folks are hiding behind these kind of racist thoughts, according to the framework that you used, right? Why do you think that would be important to know as an athletic administrator and or as an owner of an organization, to know that, wow, this is kind of the standing of where our fans are currently at this point in time, and I guess what I'm asking is, like, practically, what do you think they can use and do with the data that you have?
Very good question.
I think it really more points to like asking what you can do for your athletes. And usually, like my thinking behind it is that you can have a sports league without fans. Like we've seen it all of this year of sports leagues operating without fans. If they really just wanted to boycott and leave and not watch the sport anymore, you could still operate. But you can't have a league without players. No way.
I think that's
So as much as you want to sit up there and just understand that colorblind racism really is voiced under these pressures, again, you gotta make a choice about what you really prioritize in your stakeholder.
Yeah, it's a moral thing.
Economics.
Thanks, Merlin, appreciate it. I'm gonna pass it off to Dr. Bird.
Thank you, and again, excellent job, Merlin. So appreciated working with you. I'm gonna combine Dr. Merlin and Dr. McGarry's question, because I think what Dr. McGarry is challenging you to consider is the identity of those that have the loudest voices on Facebook and Twitter, perhaps.
Yeah.
And I think what Dr. Mala may be pressing you to think about is how you can inform administrators and managers that those voices, as you say, aren't maybe loud and maybe using this platform in ways that are both overtly and implicitly biased, but that may not be the reflection of the entire fan base. And I think that's maybe where Dr. Mala's getting you to think about how you can think about your findings as reflective of a certain segment of fans that perhaps aren't, again, reflective of the entire spectrum of fans for an organization. And that's, I think, what you're referencing in terms of the success of the WNBA and their recognition that actually embracing the activism of their athletes connects to very specific and really important stakeholder groups that are their fans. So I think you can see those kind of two comments kind of working together. So I'll ask you more about critical race theory, and maybe you can share a bit more about your decision to use one tenant in particular on colorblind racism, and if there are other aspects, and again, I'm not a critical scholar, so I'm gonna couch my question in, help me better understand why colorblind racism was the most appropriate of those tenets, and maybe some other thoughts on if you were to extend this work and move forward, are there other aspects of CRT that you see as beneficial?
So really it came down to making this study a bit more manageable given the time and circumstances. So being able to code for social identity, threat management themes, that was a lot within itself. And following back to the same reviews over and over again, making sure I follow line with those themes. It was a lot. But one thing you asked me at the beginning of this is how I'm gonna make mine different. How am I gonna contribute to the field that he didn't do? So by utilizing colorblind racism, just picking one thing and just seeing how it worked out just made it manageable for me. And again, it made it easy because Vanilla Silva already established how these 4 themes work, and it wasn't just, the racism wasn't my perception, it was work that was already established. So all I had to do was just understand by the definition and just apply it. And it just made it easier to manage within the time circumstances. And I also wanted to make a connected point to something you wanted me to think about. I feel like just sports as a whole as I said earlier, it offers a lot of spaces and opportunities for conversation. So if sports organizations really want to cultivate their agendas around backing up their players and addressing societal issues, then they can use their platform to not only support their players, but to be able to educate the audience. You can see like the WNBA, they're coming out with a documentary that's coming out this month, and that's educating them on not what they just went through for a COVID perspective, but societal issues, how they came together, how they came up with the decisions to dedicate their season to Breonna Taylor. Like the WNBA is designed to educate everybody and not just shy away from the opportunity.
I'll transfer it back to Dr. McGarry if you want to take a second round.
Yeah, I'll pick up on this a little bit more too. First of all, I'm not going to argue with you highlighting the WNBA at the end, and we talked about that in a couple of our meetings along the way, in holding that league, and it's top to bottom, right, for the most part, except for a couple of key examples that you also pointed out. But one of the things that I think still stands out to me here and is embedded in critical race theory is the inseparability of capitalism and racism, and that is throughout what you focused on here. And so I'd be curious to have you comment a bit more on, again, what Dr. Burton was asking on the use of critical race theory and the reality, right? The permanence of racism is one of the tenets. The reality of that link between capitalism and racism, and how you saw that playing itself out in this study.
Sure, so again, I'm gonna go to a certain slide if I can find it. And I think this, to answer the question better, it's towards
I have to pee, so I turned off my camera. Okay.
Punishment commentary really noted this, and there was, here we are. So I'm gonna share my screen. So it was the narratives behind punishment commentary and abstract liberalism, and how fans engage in discussing ideas around, salaries and lower like lines of work. And that also plays a huge role in how athletes move around themselves too, because it's easy for prominent athletes like LeBron James that are, financially way more well off than a rookie in the NBA, and he may be advocating for protests and to boycott an entire season, but at the same time, maybe the rookie in the league doesn't have that thoughts because he wants that money. He's gonna have to live off that, especially when you're talking about athletes that are coming from impoverished places. And if fan reactions to that, it makes this narrative that, you know, athletes don't go through this type of same thing too. So if I go back to the tab,
I want him to take his time.
so again, it's like this comment right here, punishment commentary along with abstract liberalism. And part of abstract liberalism points to the idea of economic choices and opportunities. The idea that everybody's on a level playing field, that's just not true when it comes to capitalism. The people that earn theirs keep theirs. And it plays a huge role in how, you know, we move around and how we act. Hopefully that kind of answered that question sufficiently.
It did, and I would also add to it, you had made a comment earlier about, you know, we've seen how sports can survive without fans, and that, in response to Dr. Mala's question, that teams and leagues should rally behind their athletes as opposed to their fans. And so I would push you to keep thinking about how an owner might think about an athlete who is very politically active and vocal, who's on the low end of the salary scale compared to a LeBron James, and how again capitalism is embedded in the ways in which owners, I will say in particular, support or don't support individual athletes who are activists. So just again, kind of, this is complex, and I think it's important to continue to, you know, dig in to, as you did already, like what else is going on here in these comments, and who's making them, and what kind of impact they do or do not have.
That's what I would have.
Absolutely.
Just one quick, just to stay on this matter of critical race theory, and I know that obviously according to our constraints now, you limited yourself in terms of what tenets to focus on, Merlin, and I know one of the tenets of critical race theory is interest convergence, and would like for you to, anyways, can you speak to, I know you didn't code for it or anything along that line, but just thinking about it now, I feel like there's a lot that can be said from that tenet, both the resistance to the protests within the Facebook and Twitter comments in terms of interest convergence, and even why sport leagues are now supporting kind of athlete activism, whereas, you know, when we use the NFL example, folks were kind of strongly against that, and now, whatever, 2-3 years later, their end zones say Black Lives Matter at this point, right? So can you speak a little bit to this matter of interest convergence and what you noticed within your data?
Yes.
Democracy
Sure.
has changed.
So interest convergence is the idea of white elites and the working class alike. And they have, in terms of their motives. So for example, the NBA players in the start of summer 2020, they wanted to play, but they also wanted to raise awareness on societal issues. And a lot of these white owners, they wanted to keep their money and hold on to their money, and usually don't want to get into the financial risk that comes with speaking out on this stuff. So you have a colliding in motives. So what does Adam Silver do? He finds a way to get them into a bubble so you can play, but also gives them the platform, the opportunities of like, hey, you can put these words on the back of your jerseys. At press conferences, you're allowed to say this. And now you align these motives and put them together. And the other example I really think of is, again, the NFL, in terms of how they react to Colin Kaepernick at first. I really feel like they were just following the wave of where the fans were going to. The resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement really kind of just made it popular. And the NFL recognized that and they said, oh, we got to get on this train too. And wanted to make money off of that. But back in 2017, nobody was saying it. So they're like, Colin, please go over there and eat dollars.
So does that,
I kind of appreciate his
theme
bluntness.
kind of come out at all in your analysis of your data, as you can kind of, in your mind, look at your data and what you coded and analyzed, in terms of like, do you think interest convergence can help you explain a little more about their specific comments and why folks may be so negative towards
Mhm.
athlete activism and
Yeah.
Milwaukee Bucks protests?
To an extent, yes. And really, it comes down to evolution. And again, like when we talk about the NFL, the NBA, the NFL especially, that was over a period of time of their opinion changing and their perspective changing. That was something I couldn't really measure.
At that
But in
time.
terms of the fans, in terms of interest convergence, they have these motives of just wanting to play and not really wanting to talk about politics. And that plays a huge role in it plays a huge role in what the athletes are trying.
Interesting.
And sometimes I'm not sure, it would take more time to really understand how can we bring them together. And really that just comes down to just educating fans on why this stuff is important.
Economic studies.
I guess
Yes,
that's
I really feel
anthropology
like the
studies.
sports and politics
Hold on.
argument, it's really just getting out there.
Sure. I think this just, again, highlights Dr. McGarry's first question and what you can do for future research and even analyzing the demographics, right? And seeing who is resistant towards it, who do they look like, and maybe kind of analyzing it through this
It
aspect
can
of
be a
critical
long-term
race theory.
research.
Thanks, Merlin.
That's literally what I wrote
And
right here.
and just one last comment to that. It's like that's also just really hard.
Yes, but it's
I referenced
possible.
this in my thesis, the idea of like
PhD.
national attachment patriotism.
Right.
And
Doctor.
it really points to the idea that there's a lot of people out there that just don't want to look towards themselves and their own prejudice. It's like, how dare me? I'm American. I love this. I stand for the flag. How dare I can't be racist. No way. So the thing that like we can bring them in and allow them to be transparent and to get that data, that's really hard.
But
Interesting.
but you can.
Yeah, I have already thought of ways.
Okay.
Sometime we'll talk about how you can design studies to be able to surface what you're referencing. So I'm gonna break from protocol for just a moment to ask another member of the audience who you acknowledged that had been really supportive and kind of a secondary team of advisors, and Max Klein is gonna ask a question.
So obviously, first I wanted to congratulate you on the
So
great
he's a
work.
PhD student.
And one thing that I've said I'm impressed with is you get feedback, and then the feedback is incorporated within days or hours, which is relatively unheard of in the academic field of slow-moving processes in research. And it was just a pleasure to work with you and be a peer degriever. So I wanted to ask a question, also a research-related question, but something that you hadn't brought up. So what your study focused on was the social identity threat management, a lot of related to fans or people who are behind a keyboard, and people that aren't in power positions. And so I'm wondering what you think the difference would be in measuring the social identity threat management of in response to Black athlete activism by mostly white executives in power positions who can have the ability to threaten the livelihood of these players that these people behind the keyboard do not have that ability.
Nice.
Question.
Yeah, that plays a huge part, and I feel like the best way to address that is through an interview, to really have that sit-down conversation, and really to get their perspective and ask questions about what their agenda is. Can we really get into a look into why you're operating a league the way that you are? These fans, at the end of the day, they're at the bottom, and as much as they want to voice their opinion, it doesn't make the legal changes or the systemic changes of these organizations until it comes down to
Right,
at the top.
but the executives will pander to the money. So yeah, that's great.
That's a very good question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max.
At this point, we're about an hour in, so I'll, if there's any other questions from members of the audience, maybe we'll have time for one or two more questions.
I was going to
Raise your hand
do.
or unmute yourself and ask.
Have your
Okay,
voice.
Dr. Paul.
Hey, bro, Congratulations, brother. This is Uncle Paul. I'm very proud of you, bro. I do have a question. Your research focuses on the social identity threat management of
I knew he
fans.
was going to ask the
Were you
question.
able to gauge the social identity threat response of the black athletes themselves?
To an extent, yes. For the most part, as we've seen, like the Milwaukee Bucks protests, it started in August, and now we've been able to look over time to see what they've done previously. And they haven't moved in terms of their stance. That's not something that I looked in terms of the content. Again, I was looking for the aspect of social identity threat management from the aspect that the protests acted as a threat. So it's from the protest to the individual, and that stopped at that. And that was the only connection that I looked into. But I do see that the Bucks, they haven't moved their stance moving forward past that.
Thank you.
Dr. McComb, that's a very interesting question, and I think that would elicit another excellent thesis or dissertation study to really dig into how athletes, specifically those that are not perhaps the most, as Dr. McGarry said, lucrative or well-known or well-regarded, how they would respond to these kinds of
And how they
threats
manage those
against
things.
their identity.
Yes.
So thanks for raising that.
Great question.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We have time perhaps for one more question.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Alrighty. So speaking on the topic of threats to social identity and fan base, can you discuss why you picked basketball as opposed to football, which can be seen as the identifiable American sport and arguably has a wider fan base? I mean, football has had its fair share of protests, and Kilmarnock can kind of be seen as the switch from black athletes from focusing on voting and civil rights to focusing on police brutality. Even the white player Chris Kluwe has been advocating for same-sex marriage for quite a while now too.
Thank you for that question. And really, it came down to an event that kind of just come home for me. Basketball is my favorite sport growing up, and that's what I really attached to. So it was easy for me to kind of just pick a team. And I'm not a Bucks fan, but I watch basketball regularly. So that played a huge part in why I picked that protest in particular. But I do really appreciate the points you brought about the NFL, especially since they're an older league, and they have more owners, more white owners. There's only one black owner in the NBA, Michael Jordan. So I feel like that's a really awesome dimension to look into as well.
Awesome. Good. Great question.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to ask for members of the audience to leave the WebEx at this point so that the committee can have a conversation, and then Merlin, I'll put you into a breakout room and bring you back after the committee.